Kia ora, Aotearoa. Good evening and welcome to the Union Report, where we review the news week through the lens of industrial disputes with union leaders, communicators and politicians. Joining me tonight to discuss events is CTU economist Dr. Bill Rosenberg and the National Campaign Coordinator with the Service and Food Workers Union, Annie Newman. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, how does a zero budget impact on workers and public servants? Bill English claims we all liked it. Really? Issue 2, what will the Living Wage campaign do for social justice in New Zealand? And issue 3, how does iwi involvement in the AFCO industrial dispute change the wider dialogue for labour relations in New Zealand? Plus, we'll wrap the show with a final thought, but let's start tonight with issue 1. The zero budget has been launched, and Bill English amazingly claimed at his National Party conference that because the usual voices of opposition were so quiet, that means the government's promise of austerity has been accepted. Bill, you're one of the usual voices of opposition. Do you agree with the Finance Minister? Does the CTU welcome the zero budget with open arms?
Absolutely not. Our big concern about it is the effect on the whole economy. This might not be austerity like in Greece or the United Kingdom, but this is austerity light. And this is setting it's setting up a situation where if anything goes wrong with the economy, and there's a high likelihood that it will, I can come back to that, then we are in a situation where the government is actually tightening up the economy. It's actually taking activity out of the economy. And this is what the Treasury forecasts show, that over the next 4 years, what the government is doing will actually take growth out of the economy.
Right. So
we've
had warnings from Treasury that many of the black swans are coming home to roost in terms of overseas debt, in terms of the euro crisis, America. We are seeing those black swans starting to happen and occur. Now, what's the government doing about that?
Well, as far as we can see, it's just saying, look, there's a storm coming. We need to lash everything up and tighten up and cut our spending and all that kind of thing. Now, if there's a single lesson that we can learn from Europe, it is that when things are bad, that's not the time for the government to cut expenditure because it actually adds to the problem. It actually creates a recession. It actually creates increased unemployment.
How can the government justify cutting back on social services? We know in the 90s when we did that last time, our suicide rate tripled. They can't pretend to not know that there are social consequences and collateral damage with these cutbacks, can they? And
so the way that they deal with it is they say, yes, we know all that, so we're going to be very careful about this, and we're going to, and that during the 2008-2009 recession, we didn't cut back the same way, well, they don't say this, but we didn't cut back in the same way as Ruth Richardson did in 1991, but we allowed those that social spending to increase. Now, what's interesting this time round is that thanks to ACT and with the cooperation of National, they've put in this cap on government spending.
That's right.
Now, if that cap had been in 2009, we would have been in the Ruth Richardson situation.
Right.
Because government spending increased in 2009 by almost 10%. And you could argue very strongly that that's actually what kept the economy moving sufficiently, that we didn't go deeply into a depression instead of just a recession. If that cap had been in place, then we would have been in much deeper trouble.
Annie, doesn't Bill English's confidence suggest that getting back to surplus mantra and damn the social consequences has been accepted across the political spectrum?
I think National would like to think that there was a consensus across the political spectrum, but I'm sure that that's not the case, that there are other parties and there are many people in New Zealand who don't want to see the sort of suffering that occurs when you focus blindly on a surplus at the expense of people, in fact, who are bearing the consequences of the types of measures that National's brought in with this zero budget.
Do you think they've conned the public into buying it, though?
I don't think they have conned the public, and I think if we look at people like workers who are on $13.50 an hour or $15 an hour, it makes no sense to them at all to be talking about a surplus. For them, they're struggling to get by on a day-to-day basis, and what they need is some kind of investment in their lives so that they can live with a bit more dignity and decency.
Dignity just doesn't matter these days, though, does it? I mean, we seem to have a mentality out there that you're lucky to have a job in a recession and don't complain. That's the message from the National Party.
I don't think people realise how much poverty, many people don't realise how much poverty exists out there. You know, where kids of 17 are going out to earn money on $13.50 just to contribute to the family budget, where children are earning money and they're due to suffer in this budget because they're having their tax credits cut.
That's right.
I think that there's a lot of suffering out there, and a lot of people don't realise the extent to which that's a reality in New Zealand now.
Is that the egalitarian New Zealand you know? Is that the egalitarian New Zealand you want?
I think egalitarianism is a bit of a myth, actually.
Yep.
I don't think that there is egalitarianism. I think that we are one of the most unequal countries in the world. We're one of the most unequal countries in the OECD. We have growing poverty and inequality, and that means a lot of people are suffering. And I think that there's a tendency for many people to lose the ability to empathise with those around them who have less and who are struggling.
Bill, 267,000 New Zealanders are unemployed or underemployed, while 270,000 children live in poverty. Does this zero budget leave them to rot? I mean, what are the alternatives to this economic Darwinism?
Well, I think it does, and it doesn't address the big issues that do confront ordinary New Zealanders. So, I mean, it's a continuation of the tax cuts in 2010 that gave $2.2 billion to the top 10%. And we're now looking at the tax changes that they are now bringing in to try and make up for that huge hole they actually made in their budget. There's $249 million worth, it's not nearly enough, $249 million worth of new tax revenue that will come in through this budget. But you look at the kinds of people that's attacking. So the inland revenue say that they're going to go out after tax avoiders. The kind of tax avoiders they're talking about are seasonal workers who are getting money under the table, and people working in accommodation and that kind of thing, getting tips. Now, look, I don't condone people avoiding tax, but hell, there's the inland revenue have followed closely the 161 richest people in New Zealand, the ones with $50 million of wealth or more. And only 60 of them are declaring anything more, in 2008, were declaring anything more than the top tax rate.
So is there one law for the rich and one law for the rest of New Zealand?
Well, I think that's the mentality of the government, that it sees the way to get the economy moving is to look after the rich. And if the rich are thriving, then we all will thrive. And it's this mentality that I think you were referring to before, that we should be thankful for the rich giving us jobs, and we should be thankful if they give us decent jobs. But in fact, it doesn't work like that, because what we saw, what we've seen in the past is that that if you just leave it to the market, which doesn't really exist, to the market, then they will pay. They'll base business on low-cost jobs, and the jobs simply won't come. They will invest in speculative ventures like property and like private equity investment, which is really just there to make money out of boosting up the apparent value of a company and selling it off as quickly as possible.
Does trickle-down work?
Well, it doesn't, no. And I mean, we tried, you talked about the growing inequality, and during the 80s and 90s, which was the height of trickle-down theory, that was the time when we had the greatest rise in inequality over this period. That's when it really hit.
Why should the poorest members of society pay for an economic recession none of them have had any hand in making? I mean, how many of your members, for example, were on the phone in 2007, 2008 to their Wall Street stockbroker buying light crude in euros and speculating on the Goldman Sachs derivatives market? How many?
They are paying for the price of the recession. I think that that's a good description of it. We have probably 80% of our members in the Service and Food Workers Union, 23,000 members, but 80% of them will be on rates of pay between $13.50 and $16.50.
So why do your members have to pay for this this nonsense?
Well, they're having to pay for this nonsense because I think that the preference is that those who are earning a lot of money, that the rich in this country are the ones who deserve to have more.
Right.
And those who don't simply deserve to go without. We've had big battles for Oceania rest home workers. They ended up with just over 3%. This is a very small amount on $14.61, which was their rate of pay. So we've got people who are really not getting their fair share of the pie, and I don't think that there's a great deal of sympathy for that. So they're paying for the price of the recession. If they don't have investment in those workers, then they're not spending money and the recession gets worse. So from our point of view, you need to spend money in order to support these people, not charge them for prescriptions, which is what's happening in the budget.
How many of your members will be able to buy shares in the assets we're about to sell off?
There won't be any members who'll be buying shares, or there'll be very few who'll be buying shares in the assets being sold off. So these mum and dad investors are not mum and dad investors who are amongst the low paid workers of New Zealand.
So they're almost hit twice, aren't they? On the first hand, they lose the asset that they've already paid for, and their children have paid for, and their grandparents and their friends and their family, they've helped paid for. They lose that, and they can't get entry into buying the bloody shares as well either. They're hit doubly, aren't they?
And I think that the chances are that those things are going to go up in price. So that the cost of power and the cost of gas and the various things that get sold off are going to become more expensive for them.
So it's damnation upon damnation upon damnation. They're pretty angry, aren't they?
We have members who describe their life as a real struggle, and I think that there is anger about that.
Question of both of you. The top tax rate in New Zealand 25 years ago was 66 cents in the dollar. It's now 33 cents in the dollar. The richest have had their tax rate drop by 50% in a quarter of a century. Why isn't raising the top tax rate part of this debate?
Well, it should be, and certainly we support raising that top tax rate. We would like to see a 45% tax rate on around about 150,000.
That's what Australia's is, isn't it? 45 cents?
That's right. Yep. So we're actually an outlier in many ways in terms of that top tax rate. A progressive tax system, one which in which the rate goes up as incomes increase, is actually a progressive thing to do. It actually recognises the ability of people to pay, and it should be, and it's the only way that you can actually fund a social welfare system without having huge what they call effective marginal tax rates, which means that you get to a certain point in your income and suddenly you lose all the benefits, and it makes it most unattractive to get that next step in your income. If you want to have a fairer system where people actually can ramp up to the as they do better, the benefits such as working for families and accommodation supplements and things like that they level out rather than suddenly fall off like a cliff, then you do need to have more income coming from those higher income people.
Why isn't top tax the main issue here? I mean, if we're talking about we've got to cut back on services, it's only because we're not going to increase the revenue, isn't it?
It's one way of having a fairer distribution of the available money. I think that this is an issue of distribution, and a lot of people say that there's not enough money around, that employers can't afford to pay more, that government can't afford to pay more, but ultimately there are people doing very well in this country, and others are doing very poorly. So I think that the issue of tax is an important part of the equation.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, the Service and Food Workers Union are leading a movement to create a dialogue around a living wage at a time of deep poverty. How do we define that, and how do we impose it? Annie, what is this living wage campaign all about?
The Living Wage Campaign is a group of communities, faith-based groups and unions who've come together to call for workers to earn enough money so that they can survive and participate in society. So a living wage is the amount of money that's necessary for people to survive and participate. And certainly $13.50, which is the minimum wage at the moment, is not enough to survive and participate. I think one of the important things about the campaign is that this is about bringing a wide, broad-based coalition of people together, of those who are concerned about growing poverty and inequality, to see if we can do something about reducing that by lifting incomes for the lowest paid.
Is this about autonomy and sovereignty of the individual to be able to live out the life they want to in society? Because at the moment it seems a lot of people are trapped into a wage cycle that just doesn't actually cover their costs.
3% on $13.50, which is where a lot of our cleaners and aged care workers are at, is very little. So the living wage is about making a significant shift in their earning power. So as long as their wages are around $13.50, they simply can't survive. And we have
And
many...
they can't participate, can they? Can they participate in society?
We have many union members who have to work 60, 70 hours a week in order to make ends meet. If you're doing those kinds of hours, you're not having time with your family. You're not being able to go out and, have a holiday, spend some, have a meal with the family, ensure that your children go to school camps, get a decent sleep. There are many very basic issues here around the living wage which are important. So it's not just about the money, it's also about ensuring that people don't have to work every hour in the week in order to survive.
Bill, the latest meme from the right wing is that New Zealanders don't want to work for jobs advertised, yet fail to point out that these low wages mean workers may be more out of pocket from transport and childcare costs than taking the work. How do we calculate the actual cost of living in New Zealand and attempt a remuneration to meet those living costs?
Yeah, it's this theory that there's been a sudden epidemic of laziness sweeping the
amazing,
country, isn't
amazing,
it?
isn't it? Yeah.
I don't subscribe to that at all. And many of those jobs are fruit picking, that kind of thing. That it actually does. It takes some. You need transport to get there, and B, it's not at all certain that you'll have it for more than a few days.
That's right.
So. We do need to have higher wages for those areas, and I think many of our industries have been built on the idea that we're going to have low wages, and we'll simply have people leaving for Australia if we continue to
And
base
this is the
on,
problem, isn't it?
on that kind of economy. This is simply a short-sighted and unsustainable way to run an economy.
Annie, we've just had our very own Dr. Judy McGregor, a hero, people's hero from the Human Rights Commission, go undercover in the elderly care industry to denounce what she describes as modern-day slavery. If such practices are commonplace, how vital for New Zealand's equality and social justice is to challenge that with a living wage?
The living wage is really vital because we do have modern slavery, and it's not just in the aged care sector, it's in many of the sectors now. So what we need to do is to confront that issue and to say, where is the money and who do we have to ask for it? So we've got many people who are contracted out, and the contracting process is one where the tendering drives the wages down to the lowest point possible. You can't just go to one employer and get them to hike up the wages. You have to go to the people who fund those employers to deliver the services. So a lot of the focus for a living wage campaign is going to be around central government, local government, the institutions, the places where people put the funding in so that those services are delivered. They often stand behind a screen and say that this isn't our problem because the employer is the one that's responsible. So part of our challenge is to say, actually, you are responsible. Ultimately, if government is funding people to clean their buildings, then government should be taking responsibility for the fact that those workers are living on poverty wages.
Bill, on Radio Live this morning, John Key said maybe some people from the Philippines want to come here to work as a response to the low wages highlighted in the care of the elderly. How can a living wage campaign gain any traction when the Prime Minister's solution is to simply import cheaper labour?
I've got nothing against people immigration into New Zealand, and that can be a very positive thing.
Of course.
But if employers are using that as an excuse not to pay decent wages, not to train people in New Zealand, not have a decent system of education and workplace training, then it actually undermines the development of our economy. So I think that what he's in effect doing is he's threatening New Zealand workers. Look, if you don't take those wages, then we will bring in people who will work for those
How
wages.
charming. Final question, both of you. Should equality and social justice wait until we get back into surplus? Should it?
This is rubbish. No, it should not. The surplus that they're predicting is absolutely tiny. And
$200 million. And no one believes it either. Come on.
And that's an amount that they're going to get to by making lots of cuts to people who are at the bottom of the heap. So we shouldn't wait for surplus. We should be putting money into people's pockets. We can increase that rest home funding, which is the funding where people are modern slaves. We could do that immediately. And address a really critical problem in New Zealand and go some way towards providing a living wage for those workers.
You can't just wait for civil rights, can you? That you've got to fight for them, surely.
And that's the way it'll come about. But the money needed to pay those rest home workers a decent wage is about 6% of that 2.2 billion handout that went to top earners in the 2010 tax cuts. And the other thing we need to reflect on is that if the economy is starting to slow and it's been just stagnating, we've had a high level of unemployment for an abnormally long time since the recession of 2008, 2009. One of the best ways to get it going again is to actually put money in the hands of low-income people.
Yes.
Because they will go out and spend it.
That's right.
The people they spend it with will then have the money to employ other people, and it starts that virtuous cycle of getting the economy going again.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. One of the most bitter industrial disputes in recent times has ended AFCO only once iwi became involved. What are the ramifications for wider labour relations in New Zealand? Bill, this was a disgusting example of a multi-million-dollar family using hunger as a negotiating tactic. Are the CTU considering a new relationship with iwi in the wake of this dispute?
We really wanted to, we're planning to get together with iwi already. I mean, 60,000 of our members are Maori. Maori traditionally have been strong backers of the union movement. And many of those iwi leaders are actually former meat workers, teachers, people from deep involvement in the union movement. So it was a natural thing to do. And when you have so many of their people involved in that dispute, 5,000 kids going without food because of that dispute, something like I've heard the figure that something like 40% of the red meat produced in New Zealand is produced
from
by
iwis. That's right. That's correct.
From iwi Maori farmers. So they have not only a stake in it, but they have clout. And we would certainly like to develop that relationship, not simply because of that clout, but simply because we think it's the right thing to do, to have a good relationship with them. And we think that if they can get good jobs for their people, that's good for everybody.
Annie, there are many Māori workers working in low-paid jobs. Should the economic muscle of iwi be brought to empower their position, and how?
I think that community leverage is really important if we want to win more money for workers. Unions and ours as well, the Service and Food Workers Union, has recognised that as a union on its own, we can't make the kinds of steps forward for workers that we would like to. Working across the bargaining table is not enough to lift people seriously out of the poverty that they're in. So we depend on communities, and I think iwi have stepped up to the play here, and I think that it's a very fine example of what we hope we'll see right around the country as communities step in to provide support and to unite with unions and faith-based groups and others to lift the wages of those who are simply not earning enough to live a decent life.
A final question to both of you. How important development is iwi involvement in industrial disputes? I mean, this is quite unique.
It is. As I say, in terms of Maori involvement in the union movement, it goes back as long as the union movement. But in terms of this particular, it is unique, and we certainly would like to develop it. I mean, it's hard to say where it would develop, but certainly we are very keen to keep on working with them.
So the CTU will be sitting down with iwi leadership?
I'm sure it will be, and trying to encourage that relationship and see it develop in a whole lot of different ways.
Bit of a turning tide, a moment that we could look back and historically and tick?
I think it is a turning of the tide, and I think that it's come at a nice time at the same time as we've just launched the Living Wage campaign, which is all about building that broad base of community support.
It's interesting to note, just on the living wage, so many groups from very, very different political parts of the sphere all coming together. Many church groups coming together on this as well, because poverty hits them as well, doesn't it?
They have a great deal of concern about levels of poverty and inequality, and we've got most of the main churches have made a commitment at a certain level of their church and are looking to take remits to synod and so on. So we've got a lot of support from churches, also from service delivery agencies and other social justice organisations. So there are many people out there who are talking about the importance of doing something about poverty, and I think it's just about how we bring all of those voices together so we can really make a difference.
Amazing work. Thank you, panel. Let's wrap the show with a final word. Annie, your final word this week is?
Oh, I think everybody should join the Living Wage campaign.
Yes.
If they're part of a community, if they're part of a union, they should get on board. And we've got a website, a new website, www.livingwagenz.org. So I would encourage everybody to come and join and be part of this new movement.
And this is a change, isn't it? This really is actually going to forward an agenda that could genuinely lift the lot of everyone at the bottom of the
This
league.
is a new way forward.
Yeah.
Very important.
Bill, your final word this week.
Well, I'd give a message to the government that we're not going to make progress by austerity light. The way we're going to make progress is firstly by making sure that the people at the bottom of the income pile get a decent income, because that would be good for the economy. And the second thing is they actually have to get their hands on it to help businesses that will increase our exports and address the real problem, which is our international debt, which is largely private debt.
Isn't it interesting, just on that, we get so much of the debt bogeyman wheeled out to explain why we can't have these increases in budget spending or what have you. But government debt, you know, the Labour Party did what you're supposed to do during the boom time, pay that debt down. The private debt's the problem here, and that's a legacy of user pays. Is there a certain irony listening to the right wing decry a debt situation that they were fundamental in creating?
That's right. New Zealand's government debt is low by OECD standards. It's less than 30%. It won't be it. Right. The big problem is that international debt, and most of that is banks.
Right.
And what happened was the banks found they could get cheap money overseas during the 2000s, lent it to people to buy houses, and built up that debt, encouraged people, in fact, to bid up the price of houses and so on. So yes, it was and you could see that happening not just in the 2000s, but right from the 1990s. So that is a legacy of the free market doing what it does.
Great that we're looking to use even more free market mantra now. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Annie. That's it for the show. Check out our Facebook site for ongoing union campaigns and actions, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter account for all the latest show updates. Thank you for watching Aotearoa. Join us again 8 p.m. next Monday for the Union Report here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Good night, New Zealand.